Good evening, everyone. Tonight's program is brought to you by Save Ellis Island. Save Ellis Island is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service for the restoration and reuse of the historic hospital buildings on Ellis Island's south side. To learn more about us and the work being done to preserve this national icon, visit www.saveellisisland.org. Our special guest tonight is the author of, I'm going to hold up for you guys, Plentiful Country, Tyler Anbinder. He is an emeritus professor of history at George Washington University, where he taught courses on the history of American immigration and the American Civil War era. He is the author of 3 award-winning books and of numerous articles, and his publications have been honored with the Avery Craven Prize of the Organization of American Historians, the Mark Linton History Prize of the Columbus School of Journalism, and the Hubble Prize of the Society of Civil War Historians. Tyler has also held the Fulbright Commission's Thomas Jefferson Distinguished Chair in American History at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and has won 3 prestigious research grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm your moderator tonight. My name is Susan Meissner. I'm the author of A Fall of Marigolds, which is a book set on the historic hospital grounds of Ellis Island, and a proud member of the Save Ellis Island board. I have more than 750,000 books in print. I'm an author, speaker. I'll let you read the other accolades there. It's odd to talk about myself. So I'm really glad to be welcoming you tonight to this discussion. This book, Plentiful Country, the subtitle is The Great Potato Famine and the Making of Irish New York. And it's so exciting to be talking about it. It's a very historic event, and it really was life-changing for the American, the fabric of the American life. And I think I told you all about Tyler. Oh, the one thing I want to let you know is if you do have questions, and I'm sure you will, is to go ahead and type them into the chat. And when we get to about 15 minutes before the close of the hour, I will head to that chat box for your questions, and I'll try to answer all of them if we can get to them. I have a bunch of questions of my own, however, and Tyler, I really hope we get to them all, because your book is fascinating and it really paints a wonderful picture of how the Irish immigrant experience, it kind of changed the landscape of America. And I'm sure it had a great impact too on the Irish experience itself. So my first question to you is this, why did you decide to tackle this concept? And then do you have a personal tie to the Irish immigrant experience?
Well, thanks so much, by the way, for that kind introduction, Susan. Just so the people on Morningside Heights don't get upset, I think spell checker there made a mistake. It should be Columbia School of Journalism, much as my friends in Ohio, I'm sure, would like there to be a Columbus School of Journalism.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So how I got interested in this was, well, I wrote a book that came out in 2001 called 5 Points, which was a history of that most infamous 19th century New York immigrant neighborhood. And it was mostly Irish in its heyday. Mm-hmm. And as I was finishing that book, I came upon, really at the very end, just before the book was about to go to press, the newly opened records of the Immigrant Savings Bank, which was this bank opened in New York City in 1850, specifically to cater to the famine immigrants. And I looked at the bank records just before the book went to press. Mostly, I figured, well, what can I do with bank records? I can see how much money the people had. And so I found that the people in 5 Points had a lot more money than I expected, given 5 Points' reputation. So I didn't have much time to change really the substance of the book, but I added a few paragraphs about that fact. And then the book went to press. But it kind of gnawed at me afterwards. Why did these people who are supposed to be so dirt poor actually have such a decent amount of money in the bank? And so, and I already had another book project, a history of immigrant life in New York City from the first Dutch settlers all the way to the present. But even as I was working on that, I was like, this is too good a subject to pass up. So first I said, oh, I'll just write an article about the surprising savings accounts. And I wrote that article, but then that just raised more questions because people said, well, why did these people do so well? Why did they have so much more money in their bank accounts than we would have thought? And that led me to try to trace the people, the depositors over the course of their lives to try to see. Because when they opened their bank account, they would say what their occupation was. But 10, 15 years later, when they've saved a good deal of money, you didn't know what their occupation was. And, luckily what happened between 1999 when I finished 5 Points and 2016 when I began working on this book was the digital revolution. And so all those genealogical records that you'd need to go find out what were these people's occupations, once you had to go look at them on microfilm, now you could call them up in your right on your computer. And so it became something that was now feasible to trace famine immigrants. The only thing that was left, though, was the fact that because the famine immigrants so often have the same names, right? There's Patrick,
Right.
there are hundreds of Patrick Kellys in New York, and there are hundreds of Mary McCarthys in New York. And of course, people move all the time. So you don't even know if the Mary McCarthy who starts in New York is still going to be the Mary McCarthy who's in New York 10 years later. And so, but these bank records asked very detailed information about each depositor because the bank was afraid that that they either give the wrong Patrick McCarthy, the other Patrick McCarthy's money, or that someone would impersonate them because this is an era before government issued ID. So they took so much information about each depositor, identifying details that it allowed me to trace thousands of famine immigrants over the course of their lives and see what became of them. And at first I was doing that just to kind of figure out why they saved so much money. But then the stories involved in their lives of why they saved so much money were so fascinating. I thought it had to be a book. And so that's where we ended up. And then in terms of personal connection, I have, it's a relatively distant one, but yes, there's a famine immigrant on my mother's side of the family. This is my Aunt Vivian's great grandfather, who was a famine immigrant who didn't stay very long in New York City, but went to Buffalo and then worked for the New York Central Railroad in and around Buffalo for the next 50 years of his life. And so I did not know that when I started the project, but kind of as I got towards the end, I thought I really should check this out. And sure enough, there he was.
Well, that was a happy happenstance. That's
Yeah.
always nice when that happens. So for those who've only heard of the potato famine, which until I read your book included me, how bad was it in terms of the impact on humanity, there in Ireland? And then what was its socioeconomic impact?
Well, the impact was extraordinary. So Ireland had a population of 8 million at the time the potato blight struck that in part led to the famine. And about 1 out of every 8 of those 8 million, so about 1 million died. So, you think about, the COVID epidemic was pretty terrible,
Right.
especially in a place like New York City. And, you had about 1 out of every 300 Americans died of COVID, whereas here you have 1 out of every 8 people dying. So, the population of towns just dwindled, especially small ones. And so it was devastating. And then of the remaining 7 million who were still alive, another 1.5 million of those left Ireland for good, some going to England, but most going to North America, and by far the biggest of that number going to New York City.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering,
Oh, and I should mention, of course, that then has a huge impact on a place like New York City. By the
right.
end of the famine, by the mid-1850s, 1 out of every 4 adults in New York City was a famine refugee.
Oh my goodness.
You think about 1 out of every 4, right? It seems like, you might go to New York City today and say, oh, the migrants are everywhere, and they make up 1% of the population. But we're talking 1 out of every 4 adult
Yeah.
New Yorkers was a famine refugee from Ireland.
Wow, that's an incredible impact to humanity. And what you're saying here is the people that died, they starved. They died of starvation. Is that what it was?
So it's starvation and starvation related diseases,
Okay.
right? So since you're becoming so malnourished, you may succumb to an infection of some kind, or so it's hard to say. And plus, these were people who were, we don't have autopsies being done on
Right.
these people. So But you had people literally dying in the streets, dying in their cottages. We'll see in a few minutes an image of one of those cottages so people can get a
Mm.
sense of what that was like. But yeah, just people were dying everywhere.
Wow. And you called it a blight. I've heard it referred to as a blight before. And what we're talking about is the devastation of a crop that kind of kept Ireland alive. And I'm wondering, like, was it a blight that just happened just that one time and didn't happen again, or did we find ways of being able to deal with it?
So it's important to keep in mind that the the blight destroyed the potato crop. That was a fungus that destroyed potato plants, and it was carried. Spores of it were carried in the wind, so it moves across Ireland, moves actually to continental Europe, but it's a fungus that thrives in, the wetter the climate, the
Or-
more it thrives. Ireland is super wet, and so it was particularly devastating there. And then, of course, Ireland had become so impoverished through British colonialism that
Mhm.
more than half the population subsisted on nothing but potatoes. Potatoes for
Wow.
breakfast, potatoes for lunch, potatoes for dinner. So if that one crop is 90% destroyed, the results will be devastating. So the blight causes the potato crop failure, but British policy is what turned the blight into a
I
famine,
see.
because
Okay.
after several years where people were dying by the hundreds of thousands, the British were embarrassed into opening soup kitchens, which people had called for from the very beginning. Once they established the soup kitchens, people didn't die anymore of hunger,
Okay.
or of the diseases, because they were getting enough nourishment. And then after a year of that, the British said, "Oh, this costs too much money. We're not going to do this anymore." And then the death toll climbed again. So it's very clear that the blight destroys the potato crop, but the famine wouldn't have been so devastating were it not for British policy.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So, one of the questions I was going to ask you, I think you've already addressed, and that was how many famine immigrants came to the United States. And did you say it was 1.5 million? Did I hear you right?
So 1.5 million come to North America.
Mhm.
1.25 million come to the United States,
Okay.
and about of that number, about 750,000 land in New York City.
Okay.
And most of them live for some amount of time in New York City because they don't really have enough money to go much
Right.
farther.
Right. And given that they would likely not see their homeland again, I mean that they probably had to know that it was very unlikely they would ever see Ireland again. Was it desperation that made them say, "Well, we have to go," or were they believing that there was a bright future awaiting for them? Like if they knew they were never going to get back home again, was it like there were really no other good options? Is that why?
Right. I mean, it's a little of both, in the sense that everybody, all of these people pretty much knew America's reputation as a land of opportunity and of religious freedom. So in that sense, they looked forward to it. They thought this should be better. But leaving their homeland, and especially leaving their loved ones, because
Right.
you know most of the famine immigrants were in their 20s and 30s. Older
Mm.
folks tended to
Wow.
feel, I'm too fragile, I can't make such a big change. And so a hugely disproportionate number were people in their teens
Mm.
and 20s. And so those people are leaving behind their parents and grandparents, and they might never see, they expected never to see them again. And
Wow.
sometimes they would try to encourage them to come to America too and offer to send money. And some people eventually took them up on those offers, but others were very adamant about staying behind.
Right. I think that's a great way for us to segue to, you have some PowerPoint slides to show us. It'll sort of illustrate some of the things we've already been talking about. So I'll give you a moment to toggle over to your screen. And audience, if one of these pictures suggests a question to you, just maybe jot it down and or stick it in the chat, and we'll come back to that question at the end. Okay, so Tyler, it's all yours.
So you can see this, right?
Yes, looks good.
Right. So I just wanted to give the audience a sense of the change that these immigrants were experiencing. So here is a typical a typical cabin lived in by someone who grew potatoes, was a day laborer in Ireland. It's got as you can see, it's even a little stretch to call it a thatched roof. Those are most likely in the famine era, those would have been potato plant stalks that made their roof because they couldn't afford to get, if you've been to the Cotswolds, they have those beautiful thatched roofs to this day. This was nothing like that. These were stuff they could find around. And then they went from that when they left Ireland to this in New York in a place like 5 Points. And I thought I'd show this in part just to show that when the famine immigrants arrive the famine starts in 1846, New York was not these kind of prototypical tenements that we think of today. 5 Points was mostly small frame houses that were tenements. They had been subdivided into apartments. But this was really only the dawn of the building of these 5-story tenements. But what happens is so many Irish immigrants flood into New York City that landowners see what a great profit they can make if they tear down, this little house that maybe has 4 apartments and replace it with this one that has 24 apartments. And so there's this huge building boom. And so by the end of the 1850s, most of New York City looks like these brick tenements, and these little wooden houses are mostly gone. And who builds those tenements? Irish immigrants. Irish immigrants do most of the work. They, in those days, a construction site doesn't have any machinery. So all the stuff that's done today with a construction crane would have been done back then by Irish immigrants. And then I thought I'd just show people to get a sense of the Emigrant Savings Bank. Here's the one image we have of it doing business from the 19th century. Now, this is from 1879, so the clothing would have been a little different than the 1850s. But other than that, it would have been very similar to what you have today, or what you had during the famine era. And then these are those records I was telling you about where all that detailed information was kept. So for instance, we have here this fellow named Peter Lynch. He's down here at the bottom, and then I blew up his details. So it says he's a native of Rahood, and Rahood was a place with 80 inhabitants, 6 miles from Kells, County Meath, Ireland. He's been in the US 5 years next Christmas on the ship SEA. It sailed from Liverpool. And these were the questions that the bank, when you went to take out money, the bank officer would take out this book and he'd look at these information and say, okay, if you're really Peter Lynch, what was the name of the ship you sailed on? And what's your father's name? And is he alive or dead? And that's how they would test these things. And it goes on, it has the mother's maiden name. It's the first business we know of to use mother's maiden name as a security question. And then it lists his brother and his location, and his sisters and their locations, and his wife's name and her maiden name. And so this stuff can be used to track immigrants. So in this case of Peter Lynch, there were more than 100 Peter Lynches who in the United States of about this Peter Lynch's age at the time in 1860. And so if you're trying to see what happened to Peter Lynch, who arrived in 1850 and 1860, it's impossible. But with this information, you can do it. There we go. And so what I ended up finding is Peter Lynch in, of all places, Faxon, Minnesota in 1885. And the way I was able to find him is because he's living with all his siblings, Anne, Jane, Mary, James, and Ellen. And he says here, he's got one brother, James, and then the sisters are listed in the exact same order they're listed here. And then if there's any doubt here, it says he's a native of Rahood. And since Rahood only has 80 people before he leaves it, and a lot fewer after the famine, we can know this is the right person. And then his wife's name is here to prove that. And so that's how I'm able to tell the stories of people like Peter Lynch, who, start in New York as a day laborer, but ends up being a landowner in Minnesota and doing quite well for himself. And then in the book, what I do is the book focuses on the efforts of the famine immigrants to climb the socioeconomic ladder, because that's really was the obsession of the famine immigrants, right? Having come so close to death themselves, they're determined, obsessed with saving money so that they're never in that position again to watch their children starve before their eyes, or their parents, or their siblings. And so they work, work, work. And they are determined to work better and better jobs. And this kind of stands in contrast to the way historians had depicted the famine immigrants before my book. The assumption had been that because the Irish had faced so many obstacles when they arrived in America, they were the least educated immigrant group ever to arrive in America. They were the poorest immigrant group to ever arrive in America. They were discriminated against really more than any other immigrant group that had ever come to America, certainly any large immigrant group. So historians had always assumed that they started as day laborers and they stayed as day laborers their whole lives. But what I found tracing thousands of the famine immigrants, when we look at men, only a quarter of the famine immigrants actually started and ended their lives in America as day laborers, which is a huge surprise. I didn't expect this at all. This is the kind of work day laborers did. This is an image of them walking to work. You can see you had to bring your own tools to work if you're a day laborer. This guy's a chimney sweep, but they're day laborers with their shovels, and he's bringing his lunch to work there. And then you can see the main thing day laborers did was they hauled bricks and mortar up rickety ladders on scaffolding to build these hundreds and hundreds and eventually thousands of brick tenements that were built in Manhattan in the 1850s and 60s. And like I said, only about a quarter of the famine immigrants end their lives still doing work like day labor. And so that was one of the big surprises. Now, one of the things you could move up to was being a peddler. Now, you might not think peddling was such a move up. That's always been the reputation of peddling, that it was a vocation of last resort. When you couldn't hold down another kind of job, you resorted to peddling. But the immigrant bank records show that that's not the case at all. Peddlers actually made a lot of money. And part this is because very often, so like this umbrella peddlers on sunny days made umbrellas in their tenements. And then on rainy days, they took them out and sold them. So their overhead was very low. And they could sell at lower prices than stores, and they had lower manufacturing costs because they bought the raw goods and made them themselves. And then someone like an old hat dealer would, go around the tenements. He'd find somebody who's a woman whose husband had just died, who might be desperate for money. He'd buy the man's old clothes very cheaply and then sell them back on the street for a profit, maybe in the very next tenement. So looking at the immigrant bank records, which have tens of thousands of famine immigrants in them, what you see is that of the most well-to-do famine immigrants in New York, the best off were doctors and lawyers. Next after that were saloon keepers. Next after that were policemen. And then next after that were peddlers. So peddlers did better than every kind of business owner except saloon keepers, better than grocers, better than every other kind of business owner, better than all the artisans, better than all of the other white collar workers. And so, but that was part of their pitch. You dressed kind of bedraggled, so you would try to get some sympathy and hope to get some sales, but really the peddlers made a good deal of money. And those who especially did well were those who kind of monopolized a part of peddling. So one of the stories I tell in the book is there's this one parish in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland, and the immigrants from this one parish in Tyrone ended up monopolizing the charcoal peddling business. And it's not exactly clear how they ended up in that, but it was the kind of thing when you came to New York from that place, you would go and look up someone from the same parish, and you'd say, "Can you help me find a job?" And they'd say, "Sure, well, you can help me with my charcoal peddling." And then after you helped out for a while, you might venture out on your own, and you would buy the charcoal from a charcoal dealer who was also from the same part of Tyrone. And these people would divvy up Manhattan, and they'd each have certain parts that they would sell their goods in. And so these charcoal peddlers saved more money than all the other peddlers, in part because they had this kind of monopoly on this one part of the business. Then moving further up the socioeconomic ladder, you have the artisans. Those are skilled workers like printers and carpenters who had served an apprenticeship before they entered their trade. And I talk in the book about the various ways in which skilled workers entered the New York economy. When you would start out as a famine immigrant, you would start out as a journeyman printer or journeyman carpenter. That meant you worked for wages for somebody else. There's right here in the middle. That is a journeyman carpenter there. He's got his apron and that special little hat that all journeymen wore for some reason. But then a lot of the journeymen eventually would branch out and start their own businesses. So they'd be an employer. They would work for, say, builders if you're a carpenter, and then they'd hire employees to do the work. That was the case, for instance, with George P. Fox, who was also from Tyrone and starts out as a journeyman tailor, goes into business for himself, opens a tailoring shop. And the reason he seems to succeed, among others, is he was a shameless self-promoter. He bragged and bragged and bragged. And one of the things he did to accomplish this was at first he had trouble getting business, he went to Washington, D.C., and he opened a little pop-up shop in the Willard Hotel. And when he didn't get much business, he went around Capitol Hill with cloth samples, and he went to various congressmen and senators and said, "I'll make you a suit for free. Just choose the fabric." And they'd say, "Well, what's the catch?" He'd say, "No catch, but if you take it, then I'll brag that you are one of my customers." And so he did that. And so after a few years, he was able to brag that he had made suits. He didn't say sold suits. He said made suits for senators, presidents, admirals, and so forth. And that helped his business, and so on. And these are this is the fashion of the era. So you can see the kinds of clothes that Fox's employees would have made, because Fox would have been out in the front of the store wooing the customers. Now, further up the socioeconomic ladder, the next rung up are what I call lower status white collar jobs. Those would be civil service jobs and clerkships. And about 10% of the famine Irish held those kinds of jobs in this period. Now, because there's not much time, I decided to skip over that group and move right to the highest level, which are the business owners. Now, the very highest level would have been doctors, lawyers, and priests, but 999 out of every 1,000 famine immigrants couldn't aspire to those things because they didn't have the education. So for most, owning a business was their highest aspiration. And the Irish opened all sorts of businesses. One of my favorite stories that I tell in the book is of the Morgan brothers, who come to New York as teenagers. One of them starts out mucking stables, and the one who did that boarded with somebody else who was a soda maker. And it seems that through his roommates, he learned the soda making, how to make soda. First did it as an employee. Then he opens they open their own soda making business, these three Morgan brothers on the West Side. And it eventually becomes a huge New York institution, Morgan Brothers Soda. In fact, well, I don't have it here. I have back there on the shelf, I have a Morgan Brothers soda bottle that a collector gave to me. But in any case, Morgan Brothers eventually, after 50 years of business, buys up a Minnesota soda company called White Rock and takes the White Rock name, and White Rock is still in operation in New York to this day. And then to give you a sense of how ambitious these people were. So the Morgan brothers are making soda. After 25 years, they are rich, in part because they took their profits and rather than put it all in a bank, they invested it in Midtown Manhattan real estate, which was a really good thing to do. But then they got bored and like, this business runs itself and we don't have anything to do except count the money. So what did they do? They started a second business relatively late in life. They went into the moving and storage business. And one brother was left with the soda business. The other two brothers started the moving business. The moving business was just as successful, and it still operates today too. It's known as Morgan Manhattan. And if you Google Morgan Manhattan, you can get an estimate for your move right on your computer. So I love that story. Now, of course, of all the kinds of business owner to be the highest aspiration was to be a saloon keeper, because as I mentioned, saloon keepers made the most money. Here's a saloon keeper right here in 5 points. Here is his crowded bar with all the customers. And so that was, and the saloon keepers had the respect of the entire community. If your husband or let's say your son was arrested by the police, you'd go to the saloon keeper and he'd use his political connections to get you out of jail and maybe get the charges dropped. If you were sick and out of work, the saloon keeper would send food or fuel to your home and wouldn't ask for any payment in return, but would expect that once you got better, you would help him get reelected and help his allies get reelected. And so saloon keepers, as I mentioned before, they, other than doctors and lawyers, they earn the most money among Irish famine immigrants. So that's enough of me talking, but tell me what more questions you have, Susan.
That was very interesting to me. I'm going to skip one of my questions I had for you was what were the biggest challenges facing the famine immigrants? I think you answered that in your presentation. They were poor, uneducated, and discriminated against. Was there a fourth, perhaps, before we move on to my next question, as far as challenges, significant challenges?
So let's see, poor, uneducated, discriminated against.
Those are all pretty big ones.
I think those are pretty big.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, we can move on to my other question was, seeing how the Immigrant Savings Bank had such influence on the writing of this book, it made me wonder, why was there a need for an immigrant savings bank? Was there not a trust within the American institutions, or did it seem like they just needed their own place? Like what was the impetus for creating the Immigrant Savings Bank?
So it's two things. So first, this is the period before federal deposit insurance, right? Okay. So we take it for granted. We put our money in the bank. If God forbid something happens to the bank, the government gives us our money back, every penny. Back in those days, that didn't exist. And banks went bankrupt all the time. And right, we had banking crises in the 1830s, in the 18 teens. Banks went bankrupt all the time, and depositors lost all their money. And so as a result, the people were afraid to put their money in the bank. Now, and if you were poor, you were especially afraid because you had so little. So that's one reason. And so what the Immigrant Bank did was they declared as part of their mission that they were going to invest depositors' money in only the very safest investments, which they said would be New York real estate. The only thing we're going to put your money in is New York real estate, which even back then didn't fluctuate that much and was very secure. So that was the other thing. And so they promised, we're not going to buy railroad bonds, we're not going to speculate in currency, and your money is safe. And in fact, you look at the Immigrant Savings Bank, and over the years, during the Great Depression, lots of banks suspended payments. The Immigrant Savings Bank never had a run, never closed, even though most banks in the United States did, or most banks were closed at some point. Many refused to give out depositors money for a while, but the Immigrant Bank never did that.
Wow. That's saying something, actually, right? Yeah. Okay. You wrote in your book that about 1 in every 5 Irish street peddlers was a woman, which I thought was very interesting. So what was the reason for that? And was that dangerous? It seems dangerous to me.
So in terms of why that was, so peddling was something that women could, well, first of all, as we saw, it made more money than anything a woman could do, right? So the other jobs women could do would be to be a domestic servant in someone else's house. That was by far the most popular thing for women to do. But you could only do that if you were single. Nobody would hire you if you were married because these domestic servants were almost uniformly live-in servants. Right. If you wanted someone in your house, setting the fires an hour before you get up, making your breakfast before you get up, and then after you go to bed, cleaning up, putting out the fires, and you want that person living in your house. And with so many famine immigrants, not only well-to-do New Yorkers, but even middle-class New Yorkers had them. But those jobs paid very little. because you got room and board, and so you got paid very, very little. If you had kids, then that wasn't an option. And so very often, peddlers were people with young kids who, you could keep your kid with you at your little fruit stand. Um,
Or,
and in that way, you could make more money than at these other jobs, and you could deal with your kids. And then it would be more popular to be a female peddler if your kids were older
mhm,
and could take care of themselves. And then peddling is especially common for widows.
mhm.
So if your husband dies, you need to make some money. That's a quick way you can find work again, and your kids can help you with your peddling. But unlike men tended to travel around with their goods. Women tended to stay in one
Okay,
place at a stand. And fruit peddling was by far the biggest thing for women to sell.
that makes sense. And it probably wasn't quite as dangerous then if you stayed in one place, is my guess. So I wanted to ask you really quickly, are there identifiable reasons why so many civil service jobs, and I'm thinking of policemen and firemen, appeal to the Irish immigrant, or is that just a Hollywood stereotype? Because you've seen in so many movies, I'm thinking of like or plays, because I'm thinking of West Side Story, Officer O'Malley. So like is that just a stereotype, or what was the appeal of the civil servant job?
So it's not a stereotype. The Irish dominated New York police work from the time of the famine into well into the 20th century. There's a couple of things going on. First, imagine you've grown up in Ireland where if you're Catholic, you don't have the same rights as Protestants. You're not allowed to vote. Um, you're just completely disrespected. And so, and you've probably had experience with, being threatened or harassed by British troops who occupied all of Ireland. So now imagine coming to America and being given the opportunity to have a job where you're enforcing the law. And as a result, you're respected in your community. So that's a big part of it. Then another big part of it is it paid well and it paid consistently. So day laborers got paid $1 a day, but if it rained and the construction site was closed, and in those days that was what happened, then you didn't get paid. And in the winter, construction sites all closed for a couple of months because it was too cold. Um, Policemen got paid every Saturday for 6 days of work, no matter what. And it was a salary. And then eventually it had a pension, which was just an unimaginable luxury to someone who had watched their families and friends starve around them 25 years earlier. So all those things made policing very, very attractive. And then it became one of these things that, and I talked about this in the book a lot, there's so much networking going on. So the Irish get not only into policing, but into other jobs, and they use networking to help subsequent immigrants find those jobs. And so
Mm,
policing is just one of those things.
that's very interesting. Yeah, I can see where they would find great security in having a job like that after so much insecurity.
It was also a job that in that period was not so respected.
Ah,
Yet to them, it seemed like very respectable. And in
right.
the community, it was very respectable. So there weren't as many native-born New Yorkers who wanted those jobs, and there were
Right.
lots of Irish who did.
Okay. That makes sense. So, all of the famine immigrants came through Castle Garden as an immigration station, which preceded Ellis Island. So, what can you tell us about what Castle Garden was like?
Well, I have to correct you a little bit there. So Castle Garden doesn't open until 1855. So the
Oh,
the famine migration is mostly done by then.
okay.
But Castle Garden, which is the predecessor to Ellis Island, that opens in 1855 to deal with the problems that the famine immigrants have caused.
I
So the
see.
famine immigrants start arriving in 1846, 1847. And what happens is a lot of them are accosted upon arrival by shysters and con men. And in those days, there was no reception place at all or inspection place. Your ship just docked at whatever dock along the East River that the company owned or leased, and you just got off the ship and started your life in America. There was no inspection,
Oh,
no paperwork, nothing. Well, the only inspection out in the harbor before your ship landed, a doctor would come aboard and see if anybody had a fever. And if they had a fever, and it seemed like something that might be communicable, they would
Mhm.
force those people to go to Staten Island and wait till they got better, um, in the hospital there. But other than that, no inspection, and no record keeping. Um, but so as a result, the immigrants were subject to lots of fraud and uh, and that kind of thing. And so the New York State immigration commissioners decided that they needed some place for the immigrants to go where they could kind of learn about American life, um, before they were subject to these con men vultures. And so they take this old abandoned theater, Castle Garden, um, which was on a man-made island at the southern tip of New York. You can go down there. It's in Battery Park now because
Is
the
it
whole thing
really?
has been filled with landfill. So it's that Castle Clinton in the bottom of Battery Park.
I've been there. I did not know that's what I was looking at. That's amazing.
Those are the
Yeah.
foundation walls of Castle Garden. And so what they did was they opened that. Now every ship starting in 1855 had to send through ferries its people to Castle Garden. In Castle Garden, they wrote down everybody's name and how much money they had and how much luggage they brought with them. And then there were people there who would tell you, don't go to these ripoff artists. You can exchange money here. Don't give your luggage to anybody because they will run off with it, or hold it for ransom. That was a very common thing. Someone would say, I'll carry your trunk, and then they'd run away with it. Don't do that. If you wanted to buy tickets to go some other place in the United States, they would sell you those. And the state commissioners supervised this so there could be no cheating and fraud or overcharging. And then after all that, you could leave Castle Garden and enter the United States.
Wow.
And
Oh,
then
so
that operated with a couple of interruptions for fires. That operated until January 1st, 1892, when
wow.
Ellis Island opened.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for setting me straight on that too. I'm glad to know all of that now. So you mentioned that some famine immigrants decided to go elsewhere, or maybe they stayed in Manhattan for a time and then left. And I think I read in your book that California was one of the top destinations to head to next. I'm just wondering why California was so far away, and maybe what other states did they decide to go to?
Yeah, I found that really interesting. So the most popular, if you were going to leave New York State, the most popular state to go to was New Jersey, which made sense, just over the Hudson
Mhm.
River. And that's where most of the people who went to New Jersey went. They went to Hoboken, Jersey City, those kinds of places. So not far at all. But the second most popular state after New Jersey was actually California, which I found really shocking. But then when you
Right.
read the stories of the famine immigrants who left New York and went to California, you kind of see why. So, right. So who are these people who are leaving Ireland? They're desperate in many cases, but they're also super adventurous, right? Because it was a huge
Mhm.
adventure to leave Ireland, because you're gonna give up your work. You're gonna go on a ship for 5 weeks. You're
Mhm.
gonna probably sit at the docks in Liverpool for a week or two waiting for that ship, because they didn't sail on a set schedule in those
Mhm.
days. The ship left whenever the ship owner decided it was time to leave, and he had enough customers. So you're taking a huge risk. And that's what the famine immigrants are. And that's the thing that I found, was that they're very entrepreneurial. And California, even back then, kind of exemplified this adventurous
Yep.
entrepreneurship. And so the famine immigrants saw California as kind of New York on steroids, where the streets really were paved with gold, in that
Right.
euphemism, given the gold rush. And lots of people went out there for the gold rush. And then others just decided, everyone out there has lots of money because of the gold rush. I'll sell them boots, or I'll sell them liquor. Um, and real estate was cheaper there. So and the Irish famine immigrants learned very quickly that real estate was the way to wealth in the United States. And the famine immigrants bought lots of real estate. I found about 40% of the famine immigrants I traced bought real estate during their lifetimes. Not so many who stayed in New York. If you stayed in Manhattan, Only about 10% bought real estate. But those who left Manhattan bought real estate in large numbers.
Oh, wow. So it surprised you that they went to California. I'm wondering what other things surprised you in your research during the writing of this book?
Well, so the main thing that surprised me was that by the end of their lives, there were more famine immigrants who were business owners than day laborers. And it just ran totally counter to the stereotype. And in fact, by the end of their lives, the majority of the male famine immigrants have white collar jobs. And this is just not something we think about.
Yeah.
And it turns out the reason that is because a neighborhood like Five Points, so it's not the kind of place where you moved in when you arrived and you stayed your whole life. The only people who stayed in Five Points their whole lives typically were people who started a business in Five Points and thus didn't want to move, or who were part of an enclave like that. I showed that cabin at the beginning. That cabin was in this parish in County Kerry called Twosist. Now, the people from Twosist loved living in Five Points and stayed there even when they could afford to go elsewhere. But otherwise, Five Points was more of a way station on the way to your American life, whatever it would be. And so historians in the past had looked at Five Points and they'd seen, well, in 1850, most of the people lived there are laborers. In 1860, most of the people who lived there are laborers. In 1870, most of the Irish are laborers. So they assumed that the Irish were staying laborers their whole lives. But the fact was the population was constantly turning over. And the people who moved in there as laborers 10 years later would be a saloon keeper or some other business owner, and they'd have moved uptown to start their saloon or their grocery or their soda business or their tailoring business. And so that was definitely the biggest surprise.
Yeah. So we're going to move over to we do have some questions in our chat, so I'd be happy to direct those to you. And then if you do have other questions, our audience, just go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll see how many we can get to. So Frank Calella asks, over how many years did the 1.25 million Irish famine immigrants come to the NYC? And I think you mentioned that figure already, but can you just tell us again the years that they came?
Right. So exactly what years are the famine is a contested thing. The British said the famine ended very quickly, and that was important to them to say no famine, nothing to look at here. I date the famine migration as 1846 to 1854. 1846 is when the first people are dying because of the potato blight. 1854, the immigration drops off tremendously because there's a depression or a recession in the United States. So 1846 to 54 is what I consider the famine migration.
Okay. Here's a question from Paul Lennon in Drogheda, Ireland. I hope I said your city name correctly, Paul.
I think that's Drogheda.
How do you say it?
Drogheda.
Oh, sorry, I totally botched it. Drogheda. Thank you. Fantastic research, Tyler, and well done for challenging the historic and negative narrative on the Irish who immigrated to the USA. He says, usually written by the British. How many individuals did you survey in the bank records, and up until what date does your research cover?
So I looked at 15,700 depositors, and I looked at every person who opened an account at the bank from 1850 to 1858, and I chose those years because 1850 is when the bank opened. 1858, after they kept their deposit and withdrawal records for everyone who opened an account through 1858. After 1858, they still have those ledgers I showed you at the beginning that have all the information, but they don't have the deposit and withdrawal information. Plus, I figured 15,700 was probably enough.
Yes.
And so of those, about 12,000 were Irish immigrants, and about 10,000 of those were famine, who came during the famine era. The others came pre-famine. So it was a large group.
That's a lot. That's a lot. So,
and I should say, I had an army of research assistants from George Washington University and some.
Yes, I saw you acknowledge them in your acknowledgments. That's nice to give them some kudos there.
So I had very generous funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which allowed me to hire more than more than 24 research
Oh,
assistants
nice. That's
who
great.
who compiled all the stuff and digitized it and kind of got it ready for me to look at. Because obviously I couldn't have looked
Right.
at 15,700 people all by myself.
Right. Yeah, no,
I
that's
also
wonderful.
hired a professional genealogist, and she was absolutely essential to the project because I thought I was good at ancestry.com, but it
Uh-huh.
turns out I was a rank amateur compared to Janet Wilkinson Schwartz,
Yeah, that's
is
nice. I
my
see you mentioned her in your
genealogist.
acknowledgments too. Yeah, that's great. So Jim asks a great question. Wasn't the Civil War a large impetus for hiring the Irish into the jobs on the police department? We just had another question pop in, and now I can't read the first one. Yeah, was the Civil War a large impetus for hiring Irish into the jobs, police force, fire department? And we kind of talked a little bit about that service industry, but how much did the Civil War play into that?
The Civil War really didn't affect hiring the Irish as policemen. The Irish already by the mid 1850s dominated the New York City Police Department. So much so that in 1857, the New York State Legislature, which was dominated by prohibitionists who didn't like how much drinking there was in New York City,
Mm.
and
Ah,
uh, the state legislature fired all of the New York City policemen, who were mostly Irish, and replaced them with a force where immigrants were not allowed, believing
ah,
that they would stamp out drunkenness in New York. But it turned out that the new police could not keep the city orderly, and so
mm.
after about 6 months, the police hired back the Irish immigrants, and they
Is that a fact?
quickly
Wow.
came to dominate the force again. So yeah, the Civil War doesn't have such a big impact. If anything, it makes it a little less
Mm,
popular to hire the Irish with the draft riots in 1863, where the Irish get this reputation for lawlessness, though they already had
mm,
such a
yeah.
reputation before, but now even more so. And so there's some pressure to stop hiring the Irish. But by 1863, it's clear that you can't really have a New York City police force without the Irish. So nothing comes of that.
That's great. All right. So Brian asks, fascinating information that you've presented. And then he asks, what do you consider the best book on the potato famine itself? He's read The Great Hunger, but it's more than 60 years old now. So do you recommend another book on the famine, solely on the famine?
Oh, that's a tough one. I still like the book he mentions because I feel like it really gets at the um, just the drama, the human stories are really that book really tells them in a way that's hard to surpass. There's what's come since then are the best books since then are more micro studies like the famine in Cork, the famine in Dublin, the famine in Galway. But for an overall study of the famine, one I'll mention is if people want a very brief book about the famine, is there's this one by Peter Gray, a little short little book that also does a great job. But it's brief. It's like 150
Mhm.
pages. But it's a good introduction. It has great illustrations also, which the other book that he mentioned doesn't have.
No, that's great. That's great. We're getting close on time. We've got like 6 minutes left for our regular programming, but there was one question that I had for you, and I really want to ask it. Oh, the question was, how different, if we're just guessing here, how different would New York be if there had not been a potato famine? Guessing.
Right. Well, it would probably be a lot different. I mean, so there were Irish immigrants in New York, but not a huge number. And you could imagine that Irish immigrants would have continued coming to New York, but not in huge numbers. And Germans come to New York if the Irish had continued coming at the same pace they had come before, if there was no famine, Germans came in much, much higher numbers to New York starting in the mid 1850s, or actually in the early 1850s. So that you could imagine New York being a much more German city and maybe being more
Yeah.
like Milwaukee or
Ah,
Cincinnati, which
yeah.
became much more German than Irish.
Yeah.
And then you think of so much of New York's culture, the Irish saloon keeper, the Irish police officer,
Mhm.
the Irish politician, right? New York City politics was dominated by the Irish for a century, basically from 1865 to 1965. So, and so the Irish, through their political influence, had a huge impact on the shape of the city itself. So it would have been very different.
Wow. That's great to think about. So I want to mention too, before we start wrapping things up here, that Paul from Ireland is watching the show, and we answered his question, and he comes back with, "That's brilliant, Tyler, and your pronunciation of Drogheda. Did I say it right this time?"
Well, what does he say?
He says your pronunciation of his city, which you pronounced correctly, and I did not, he said is spot on. But he
So
did say,
it's
I had a decent,
Drogheda,
how did you say it?
Drogheda.
Rahada, which also means that the entire time I was reading the Thornbirds, I was saying it wrong in my head. Because I think they use the same name, Drogheda, that it was
There
not
you go.
a decent first time effort. And he said many from Northern Ireland find it hard to pronounce. So that's to make me feel better, I'm sure. And he said it's very enjoyable. I'll be buying your book, and recommending it to people here in Ireland. So wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah,
So
one of
we've
the
got,
nice things is there is an Irish edition of the book that's
is there? Nice.
doing very well. Usually, very often, Irish aren't interested in books about Irish in America, but this book has
Yeah.
proven that's wrong.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. I'm just wondering, and this is a question I did not even think I was going to pose to you. It just, our conversation here led to it. Is did you have to learn any Gaelic at all to conduct any of your research?
No,
Not at
uh,
all.
no, because due to the British
Okay.
occupation, all the records are in Irish or Latin, truthfully. So the language
Seriously.
that would have been most useful would have been Latin, because the church records from
Okay.
Ireland were really useful for me, especially when I wanted to figure out um, how old somebody was, because the famine immigrants often didn't know how old they were or what year they were born.
Yeah.
And but if the church records exist, you can find their baptisms. Um, but the baptisms are all recorded in Latin, so that was the most important language.
Wow, amazing. And in the last 2 minutes we have together before I close us all out, is I love that you dedicated this book to your parents. And so I just wanted to ask you, what kind of influence did they have on your life that you would dedicate this great book to them?
Well, they're very much an inspiration to me. They're both they've in particular been very supportive of my career, and be as being a writer, it can be a
Mhm.
lonely existence and fill you with self-doubt, and they've always been super encouraging, um and they read the drafts of my books and offer editorial suggestions. So they've been a great support in every way.
That's great to hear. Great, great, great. Well, you've been a wonderful guest. Your book was fascinating, and everything you shared with us tonight has been so wonderful. And I hope everyone enjoys the book. The copies that Save Ellis Island had in our store are gone. They've all been bought. But that does not mean you can't get the book. You can get this book wherever you buy your books, and we encourage you to do that. Go to your favorite retailer and buy Tyler's excellent book. And want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I have a few closing comments for you. We want to thank Tyler's publisher for donating 15 copies. It was a wonderful gift to be able to donate those copies so they could be bought, and all the proceeds go right back into Save Ellis Island and the care and restoration of the buildings here. And need to tell you more about who's going to be our next guest here at Save Ellis Island. If you enjoyed your time tonight, you're going to want to come back and visit with us September 19th. It's a Thursday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Ellen Marie Wiseman will be here with us discussing The Orphan Collector. It's a novel of survival during the 1918 influenza pandemic. You'll want to come back for that. Registration, as you know, is always free. And on behalf of everyone at Save Ellis Island, thank you, Tyler, for participating in this event tonight. Thank you to your publisher. Make sure you come back and join us to hear Ellen Marie Wiseman. She will be in conversation with Maria Semelios, author of The Black Angels, which are the untold stories of the nurses who helped cure tuberculosis. And please visit our website, saveellisisland.org, to find out about other upcoming events, special tours, how to become a member, to learn more about the restoration work being done here, and the many ways you can donate to help save this national icon and preserve for future generations the historic buildings on Ellis Island. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Tyler, thank you for being here. And thank you to our wonderful audience. And we'll see you back here next time. Good night, everyone.